India has issued strict new rules for Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms just weeks after the Indian government attempted to pressure Twitter to take down social media accounts it deemed, well, anti-social. The rules require any social media company to create 3 roles within India: a compliance officer who ensures that they follow local laws, a grievance officer who addresses complaints from Indian social media users, and a contact person who can actually be contacted by lawyers and other aggrieved Indian parties. The companies are also being made to publish a compliance report each month with details about how many complaints they've received and the action they've taken. They'll also be required to remove some types of content, including full or partial nudity, any sexual act, or impersonations, including morphed images. Just wondering if cartoons come under that category. The platforms will be given 3 months to comply with the new policies. Smaller platforms are being told to get their affairs in order immediately. It all follows a tense standoff between Twitter and the Indian government. Twitter reinstated several accounts that the government had ordered it take down for using what it called incendiary and baseless content. The platform ultimately took down hundreds of accounts and partially restricted others, but refused to block accounts of journalists, activists, or politicians. Ravi Prasad, the Indian Minister for Electronics and Information Technology, said while the government welcomes criticism and the right to dissent, tech companies need to do more against the abuse and misuse of social media. In Australia, there's also been another standoff, fresh legislation against social media, and Facebook calling the Australian government's bluff. A few weeks ago, the Australian government passed a world-first law aimed at making Google and Facebook pay for news content on their platforms. This followed 6 months of negotiations, and both Google and Facebook protested the new legislation on Google and Facebook. Once the sword came down, Google had agreed to pay some of the larger Australian media companies compensation for using their headlines and thumbnails on their platforms, which of course was allowing Australian news consumers to find their news stories. The local media outfits argued that they'd lost billions of Australian dollars in revenue to the new social media giants, forgetting presumably that most Australians found the stories on the Murdoch and Fairfax websites through social media. Facebook and Google had spent the months before arguing that the new laws fundamentally misunderstood how the internet worked. Facebook reacted last week by blocking all news content to Australians over the row, but since agreed to reverse its decision after they'd got the immediate attention of the media and the politicians. Robust negotiations followed as citizens responded to losing their major source of news and their ability to comment freely and share stories, the sort of thing that Facebook encourages. There's now been hurried changes to the law addressing some of Facebook's concerns. In short, the amended legislation, the News Media Bargaining Code, was passed by the Australian Parliament. The News Code encourages the tech giants and the Australian news organisations to negotiate payment deals between themselves, and it commits Facebook and Google to invest tens of millions of dollars in local digital content. If these negotiations fail, an independent arbitrator will set the price they pay the aggrieved domestic media. At the heart of it, in Facebook's view, it's the publishers themselves who choose to share their stories on social media or make them available to be shared by others, because they get value from doing that. Even on the media companies' websites, readers are encouraged to share the stories on their own Facebook pages. But what's happened in India and Australia over the past few months is just the tip of an iceberg, where national governments are trying to rein in on the rising dominance of social media. Media and news companies have been getting behind the protestations, although they've been the big winners from the rise of social media as their stories are shared beyond their limited readership. whilst complaining, of course, about the massive move to social media advertising in lieu of the traditional banner ads on their websites or display ads in their newspapers. The rise of social media has been swift, leaving both the old-style media companies and governments scratching their head trying to get a grip on the effects of the new media. A bit like the cow being artificially inseminated, it knows something amazing is going on, but hasn't quite figured it out yet. What's been flying around the internet on social media, of course, has been the assertions that Facebook, Google, Twitter and the others steal or take away original journalism for their own benefit. Well, that's simply not true on any legal standpoint. Facebook, for example, is where media companies share their stories on their own pages for their followers to find and click through to read the article. In 2020, Facebook generated approximately 5.1 billion free referrals to Australian publishers that was valued at an estimated 407 million Australian dollars to the news industry. In Google's case, they provide a thumbnail and snippet in the search results when users search for a story or an article. Both the thumbnail and snippet are provided by the originator of the news. Publishers maintain that Google should pay for listing these snippets. There is a fundamental misunderstanding of how social media works, and the politicians and media giants would be better served to get a grip on the trend towards how modern media works and get a time machine out of the 1960s news models. Well, just look around you. People everywhere are spending an increasing amount of time in front of increasingly clever screens which give the user a window to a wider world. Every day, an 80-year-old who used to enjoy wading through their newspaper daily dies, and another 100,000 people buy a new smartphone. In the Thaiger's case, 86% of people read our news on their smartphones. No one reads our news from a newspaper. And where do the majority of people find their news? Well, you won't be surprised to hear that it's social media. As for the role of the journalists, that role is also radically changing. There's now a lot more pressure on journalists to churn out more news stories faster. People don't want to wait around and watch the 6 o'clock news or read their daily edition of the newspaper anymore. They want their news now. This move to provide instant, more relevant media is the huge challenge for the big media companies as they grapple with the 21st century. And think about it. That person who drives up Patong Hill and takes a photo of a road accident, then pulls over to post the photo with a quick description about what was happening, is, well, a journalist. They're providing news to an audience. The democratisation of the news model, with social media as its catalyst, will continue to baffle traditional media and governments who used to enjoy a level of control over what stories get told. The battles of Google and Facebook with the governments of India and Australia will be followed in plenty of other countries as well. At the root of all discussions will be the difference between what governments think social media is all about and the reality about how quickly the media landscape has changed. You'll get to read about it first on a social media platform, probably on the screen you're watching this story right now. Tim Newton, reporting for the Thaiger.